We continue with the overview of the book. This is the book that we're talking about, The Pursuit of Human Well-Being, a book that is recently published by Springer. The editor of the book, I'm one of the editors. My name is Joseph Sergi, and my co-editor is Richard Estes. And we'll focus on giving you sort of an overview or a sense of chapter 13, which is the history of well-being in Europe. This chapter is co-authored by Professor Wolfgang Glatzer. He's a professor emeritus at Goethe University, Frankfurt, Germany. And Jürgen Kohl. He's a professor emeritus of sociology with the Max Weber Institute of Sociology at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. So we start out by an introduction which says it discusses how well-being in Europe is perceived and monitored. Then they shift to a presentation of concepts used to define and measure the well-being of the people of Europe. So what is Europe? The people of Europe, at least in the way this is discussed in this chapter, focuses mostly on the European Union. Okay, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna read to you the summary at the end of the chapter that sort of, is a good way to capture the essence of that chapter. One can point to clearly negative and positive aspects of the long-term development in Europe since the Middle Ages. Because of the many wars and catastrophes, the development of living conditions was profoundly delayed and disturbed, time and again, and people were deprived of the necessities of a decent life. People lived for long periods with violence and brutality. Wars and other forms of conflict claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. The people of Europe also experienced severe epidemics, famines, large fires, and other natural disasters through presumably less than on other continents. As soon as they recovered from one disaster, often another one just around the corner. Given these conditions, many Europeans did not achieve high level of well-being objective and subjective terms. Peaceful interludes and protected areas were the exception. It is also not included that people who were able to engage in authoritarian or brutal behavior did experience high levels of personal satisfaction in these difficult times. Nevertheless, material living conditions improved due to the economic growth that, on average, increased income, wealth, consumption, and nutrition. Health and sanitary conditions improved, leading to a dramatically prolonged average life expectancy. Opportunities for political participation improved when suffrage was introduced first for men and then for women. The rise of democracy enabled people to exercise more control over their living conditions, and democratic institutions provided a foundation for claims of well-being on the basis of the political process. But Europeans were confronted with new health threats such as infectious disease. Economic growth was adversely affected, and country after country had to bear the cost of unrestricted and unregulated growth, such as the damage to the environment. Although the rise of democracy increased people's control over their living conditions, democracy no longer seemed to address everyday problems. In a mixture of progress and regression, conditions both improved and deteriorated. Compared with the roller coaster development of well-being in the past, the period of relative peace and prosperity that existed for 70 years after the Second World War can be considered as historically unique and unprecedented. Economic growth cycle occurs in cycles, and the downward trend sometimes dips so low that experts speak of a crisis. Although the current economic difficulties are not as bad as those that occurred during the post war period, they have been defined as a crisis by international and European institutions. A comparison of well-being data for the years 2000 and 2007 and 2012 can be used to probe how far the crisis found resonance in people's minds. Surprisingly, we found no evidence for a significant change in life satisfaction for Europe as a whole. But some countries gained and others lost in levels of satisfaction. The economic crisis has affected the European countries differently, and people seem to experience its adverse effects differently too. When people were asked whether they could make ends meet, the percentage saying no was astonishingly high. There is a difference between general satisfaction with life and the ability to make ends meet, because the latter seems to be more sensitive to economic conditions. In general, urban areas seem to be more affected than rural areas. More importantly, those in the lower income bracket experience the economic crisis more keenly than those in the higher income bracket. The economic crisis of 2013 did adversely impact Europe as a whole, but individual countries were affected differently, as were the different socioeconomic groups. What are the future prospects? Excuse me. Going forward, what can people expect in respect to their well being? It is not sufficient to develop what is called objective well being. People require living conditions that are satisfying in both objective and subjective terms. One core element of subjective well being is overall satisfaction with life, a goal that is comprehensive but difficult to attain and to maintain at a high level. For example, we have learned that if we reach a new level of well being, often new threats to that level arise. High levels of good health are challenged by newly emerging diseases. Increasing level of education lose the power to reward because of greater competition for good jobs. And economic growth results in additional cost of economic growth. We should also be aware that satisfaction with life is not a sufficient indicator of a good society. But a life without an adequate level of satisfaction is not worth living. Since the times of ancient Greek philosophers, scholars and intellectuals have engaged in deep philosophical debates about the value of satisfaction with life or happiness. A quote often cited in this context is, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." This saying is a challenge especially for European intellectuals. Its flaw is that satisfaction is related only to one's own desires and ignores the plight of other people. Often the opposite is true. Excuse me. People who are satisfied with their own lives tend to be generous with their time and resources in caring for others. Although life satisfaction may be viewed by many people as hedonistic concept, for many others it is an empathic concept. One's own level of satisfaction also depends on the satisfaction or dissatisfaction of close relatives and friends. Moreover, in our global society, we are steadily informed by the mass media about the suffering of people around the world, be it the abduction of a young woman in Africa, earthquake damage in Nepal, war crimes in the Ukraine, or the terrorist attacks of the 11th of September 2001 in the United States. Many people in Europe and around the world were dismayed and saddened by these news, by these events, and similar sources of dissatisfaction will presumably increase. The sense of satisfaction will, the sense of well being in the future will be less dependent on individual components and more on national and global components, and should be enriched with feelings of solidarity, sympathy, recognition, attention, fairness, security, and trust. European governments and media often convey the impression that economic growth is, is the best way to solve problems of contemporary societies and elevate happiness in modern Europe. It is disappointing that the concept of qualitative growth, which takes into account the primarily negative outcomes of pure quantitative growth and highlights the search for better outcomes, remain in the background. Remain in the background. It should be the focal point of attention among public policy officials. A shift in public opinion is needed to make issues of well being and quality of life the focus of attention. Enough said, right? Okay, I'll stop here.